Cool. Welcome back to another episode of La Ventanita podcast. Jeremy, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. What have you been up to since our last recording?
What have I been up to? Man, I've been doing quite a bit of traveling recently.
Mm-hmm. Your itinerant ministry? Is this where we're starting?
kind of. But yeah, just traveling. Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like I'm super special, but just like visiting, supporting churches, people who are supporting the work, that kind of thing. So it's been good, man.
That's great, man. That's great to hear. On this episode, we have another very special guest with us. Ladies and gentlemen, would you help me welcome our president, Dr. Emanuel Padilla.
Not doctor just yet, but I appreciate the prophetic word.
I'm speaking that over your life.
Yes.
I receive it.
Yes.
Man. So, for most of you who don't know, should I say Emanuel, Ricky? Doesn't matter.
Either one. Emanuel
Okay.
Enrique, Emanuel Ricky, either way.
Emanuel Enrique is the founder and president of World Outspoken, man. Tell us what are you up to? What are you doing? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so as you said, thanks for having me on the show. I am serving as president of World Outspoken, helped to start World Outspoken way back in 2016 and have been doing the work ever since. We are an organization, a nonprofit that helps to train churches that are dealing with cultural change. We say mestizo churches that are in the in-between. And when we say that they're dealing with cultural change, we usually mean migrant churches, right? Mm-hmm. Churches that were started by our folks, gente latina, Koreanos, Filipinos, Romanians, you name it. There are plenty of Romanian, Puerto Rican, Dominican, etc. churches that were started by people who were believers and pastors in their home countries and came here and launched churches in the U.S. Well, those churches have grown, they've aged, and now they're at a point where the leadership that's taking on the leadership of the church were born here. And they probably don't speak the language of the original congregation. They probably think differently. They probably behave differently in terms of their cultural makeup. And that's caused quite a bit of conflict. And so World Outspoken is looking to support churches as they navigate those changes, deal with the realities of a transforming congregation and then transforming context around them.
And well, we appreciate your leadership. We appreciate your heart for the church, for the world. So thank you for that. Today on this episode, if you've noticed in our title, we're going to be talking about Vico C is starting a church. Now, I want to open this up for both of you. Let's say you encounter a guy like me, ignorant of who Vico C is, no idea, have never heard his name before. Can you give us a brief bio of who is Vico C?
Man.
Yeah, there's so much to say. There's so much to say. Yeah, so by the way, me and Ricky, we might geek out on this episode because of the influence. Yeah, so Vico C, he is considered el filósofo, that's the name, the philosopher of rap. He's a rapper from Puerto Rico who was especially big in the 90s into the 2000s. In many ways, I even want to say, Ricky, you could correct me if I'm wrong. He's almost like the godfather of Spanish rap.
Not almost. He is.
He is, right?
Yeah. So Vico C moved to New York City in the 80s. Early 80s, he moved to New York City. A lot of Puerto Ricans have been doing that since the 1950s. Operation Bootstrap has been sending Puerto Ricans to the East Coast for a long time, especially in New York. And so he moved to New York for a little while and encountered hip-hop in New York. Now, it's worth noting that from the origins of hip-hop, there have been Latinos. As early as hip-hop exists, there have been Puerto Rican beatboxers and dancers and everything else. We've been a part of the movement from the beginning. And so he encounters hip-hop in New York. He comes back, moves back to Puerto Rico after some years. And early in his return to Puerto Rico, he encounters a bunch of Puerto Ricans doing like ciphers, but they're rapping in English. And so they're like showing out in front of all these Puerto Ricans that they A, are doing something in English, and B, that they're doing this new genre of music called hip hop. Well, Vico C, it dawned on him, well, wait a minute. We could do this in Spanish. There's no reason it has to be done in English.
Right.
And there's a great documentary, or not a documentary, there's a great movie that was made of Vico C's life where they actually show this moment where he walks up onto a cipher, and for the first time ever, someone raps in Spanish. It's Vico C. And everyone, remember that scene in that Tropic Thunder movie where they dunk the ball and everyone's like, foul, technical, and they just don't know what to do? It's a similar thing, right? This dude raps in Spanish, and for a second, no one knows how to respond. And then it's chaos. Like, everyone's like, this is what we needed. This is what we were looking for. So in terms of Spanish hip hop, he is it's pretty non-debated, right? That he is the founder of Spanish language hip hop.
And he was a believer, which is really interesting because although he was a believer, even people who don't make Christian música urbana, like, they consider him like the Nas. Maybe, right? Am I wrong in saying that, Ricky? They consider him like the Nas of la música urbana. So really, really huge. Somebody that I grew up listening to since I was a kid, was unashamed about his faith. But man, there's so much to be said about him. So yeah, that's who Vico C is. Just that, or at least that's a snapshot. There's more to say, but that's a snapshot.
Man, well, I mean, I appreciate you guys sharing that, because it's helpful in framing our conversation today as we talk about hip hop and church planting. I do want to lean into that a little bit more as we transition into our first segment of the show, La Plena, where we, it's a phrase, your Ecuadorian phrase.
Yes,
where,
sir.
It's like, for real. So I do want to unpack that a little bit more of Vico C leaving his footprint as the godfather of Spanish hip hop.
Let's just say hip hop. We got to give him his flowers.
Okay. Yes.
Not just Spanish hip hop.
Let's say hip hop. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You're right. Thank you for correcting me.
No, I wasn't trying to correct you. I just wanted to give him his flowers.
I mean, you guys know significantly more about his impact and his influence, but what was it about hip hop culture that drew him in and felt like this is where he belonged?
I think for me, one is the fact that the way he rapped was in Spanish, and for many of those who don't know, Spanish was actually my first language, although I was born in the United States. So the fact that he rapped in Spanish, but the way that he rapped in Spanish was just as good as rappers that I heard in English was like huge for me and resonated with me. Like the way he uses his metaphors, his wordplay, I mean, all of that. He even sang before Drake was even thought of. Like, man, the way he put that all together was really, really dope.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Vico C and Spanish hip hop in general is that right out of the gate, there's a connection to spirituality, right? Vico C's relationship with the church is not simple. We should say that, right? He was a believer, but he was a rapper. Not only was he a rapper, but after a car accident in the Dominican Republic, he ended up becoming an addict. They gave him prescription morphine, I think, and they gave him more than they should have and sent him home. This is the 90s. People didn't know better yet. Yeah. They sent him home with the drugs, not realizing what that could do. And so his relationship with the church is not simple because he was doing a genre of music that in Puerto Rico would soon politicians would try to ban it pretty soon.
Wow.
And so so he dealt with, he was a kind of political symbol. He was a kind of symbol of street faith, right? And that drug vice, I think, also plays a role in the ways that it's perceived. In the 90s, especially in Puerto Rico, there were huge ministries, separate from the church, but still Christian ministries, that were all about addressing the issue of drugs in our communities. And so the fact that this man openly told his stories, there's that song, there's a song called Yo estuve dándote vida, I've been giving you life. It's a song that's hard to listen to because it's him retelling the story of the time that he overdosed before going up on stage and trying to perform at a concert and passing out, almost dying. And his father has to come backstage, get him, and it's his dad who's like holding him and praying. But he, in the song, is saying, yeah, my earthly father is here praying, but it's the heavenly father who's keeping me alive, because I should have died right there on that stage.
Yeah.
And so stuff like that, I think, makes the relationship between, it starts to forge the relationship between hip hop, ministries that deal with drugs and violence, etc., and the church.
Man, I want to put a pin on that because I think it's super helpful, especially in framing our conversation moving forward. Man, you guys mentioned that. I mean, he started up in the 90s. It seems like the 90s, early 2000s. That was like, well, the 80s and 90s. That was the era of hip hop.
Golden era.
And so now we're here, crazy, in 2020s. Still feeling the effects that have been left from the 90s, and we see different rappers and artists coming up. So can you talk a little bit about the impact of hip hop culture or música urbana?
I think it's worth saying that hip hop is struggle music, right? Like it's music made from the struggle, and so I think part of the reason it resonates is exactly that it speaks to the lived experience of the struggle for Latinos, for Black communities, for everyone, really. That's why it works globally, right? It's the language of struggle in many ways, and so I think it works that way across the globe because of that.
And I would even say many times in seminaries, universities, we dissect hip hop in order to reach hip hop, when I think we need to make a shift. I'm not an academic or anything. This is for Ricky. You could take this one if you think it's worthy to take it to the academy. But I don't think we need to dissect hip hop in order to reach hip hop as much as we need to learn how hip hop is affecting not just hip hoppers and people who make it, but people who consume it, which is a large base. Hip hop is the medium, probably the most influential medium. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Well,
cosign. Yeah, I got nothing to add.
So when Ricky drops the book, just remember, you heard it first on La Ventanita podcast.
Man.
By the way, before we move on too quickly from that, as we think about hip hop's influence on our communities, it was so influential. I think I mentioned this earlier, that politicians on the island of Puerto Rico tried to ban música urbana, specifically reggaeton. There were these huge reggaeton parties that were happening in the projects, los caseríos in Puerto Rico. People were twerking their behinds off, perreando toque da, and the politicians thought this needs to stop. And the church had to make a kind of decision there. The church had to decide where it was going to land on this. If it was going to affirm the political understanding of Spanish language hip hop, reggaeton, all these different genres that were popping up in the different caseríos, or if they were going to affirm the language itself, the language of struggle. You can imagine most churches who are wrapped up in a kind of respectability politics, right? We have to look good in front of the U.S. Americans. We have to look good in front of the white folk. Most of them leaned on the kind of political response to demonize some of hip hop. And so it took a while for the church to to make sense of its relationship to hip hop. And there's still some Spanish language migrant churches. There's still some Pentecostal churches out there that want nothing to do with this genre. I grew up in one of those. I'll never forget, there was a pastor, my pastor as a kid, when I started getting involved in the worlds of hip hop, he said, "Esa música no es de Dios. That music is not of God. But we make exception because we know you." So it was okay that I was doing hip hop, but the genre was not okay.
Wow. Man, that was completely different from my experience, actually. When I was growing up and my church was here, actually, yeah, in the area where I'm at now, I remember, man, like, it was actually something that was used for things like outreach. If we were ministering to the least of these, man, you know, that we just knew we had a show. You know, that was just kind of the way it worked. But it's funny, to your point, Ricky, that many times when we were introduced, the pastor was like, he would always start with like a biblical example of a prophetic voice. You know, he'd be like, you know, en los tiempos del Antiguo Testamento, había profetas como Ezequiel. And then they'd be like, estos raperos son jóvenes, pero son los nuevos Ezequieles de nuestro día. It was like they had to kind of...
They had to hype it up. They had to justify it.
They had to justify it before bringing us on. You know?
Telling you, man.
Just in case,
that's real.
Just in case they got backlash later. But
that's
Ricky,
real.
are you gonna spit something for us?
Nah, I don't got it no more, man.
Okay.
The other day, I tried to rap one of my own songs. I was trying to show out in front of my wife, and I almost ran out of breath mid verse, yo. I was like, I can't do this no more.
Yeah, get back in shape.
Yeah, yo, for real. The lungs don't got it no more.
Man, that helps segue us into talking about contextualization. I know both of you have some experience with this, especially in the area of study, in the academics. Can you tell us a little bit why contextualization is necessary, especially in this marriage with hip hop and church planting or church ministry?
Yeah, so contextualization is all about communication, ultimately. And I actually like this definition. I'm going to read it from it's a practitioner, church planter, pastor. His name is Hadi Luis. I love his definition. He says contextualization is simply communicating in a way that the receiver could understand the message in his or her heart language while maintaining the integrity of the content. So essentially, contextualization has to do with knowing how to communicate to a people group without losing the authenticity of whatever that message is. And for us, when we think about contextualizing the gospel, we're talking about keeping the integrity of the message, yet making it palatable for those people who we're trying to reach. And in this case, for me, it's for the people who live on the south and south side of West Palm Beach, which are heavily influenced, many, especially young adults, heavily influenced by hip hop culture.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, I love that definition. I mentioned earlier that hip hop is its own language. It's the language of struggle, right? And so if we are going to contextualize to people in the struggle, whatever that might mean, I do think that hip hop needs to be at least one of the languages that we speak, at least one of them, right? I'll add in terms of context, I've said all sorts of things already that hint to the ways that I think about ministry and how we approach things. I've brought up history, right? When I said Operation Bootstrap sent a bunch of Puerto Ricans to New York, I like to know, how did we get here and why are we here, right? And I like to know the political influences. I like to know the cultural influences. I like to know if there's a dynamic, right? Did Titi Marisol get here first and then decide everyone needed to follow her, or did something else happen, right? I like to know the figures involved, right? So just as an example, I brought up the thing about the ministries to people who were addicts, right? People who were struggling with drug use. things that I like to do is I like to get a book and read on specifically those ministries and where they started and why they exist. There's a great book called Addicted to Christ, Remaking Men in Puerto Rican Pentecostal Drug Ministries. It's super specific sociology, but it's super helpful to understanding, this was a part of the formation of my experience as a Puerto Rican in Central Florida. You couldn't go to the grocery store without encountering one of the brothers from one of these ministries selling you a flan. Right? They were always out there selling flan, right? And so this is a part of the culture of the neighborhood. You knew these ministries existed, and they intersected with the ways that hip hop shaped the world around us. And so I try to have as thick an understanding of the community, politically, socially, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's part of good contextualization.
Right.
Man. And I think we stand on good biblical ground too. I think contextualization is something that we see especially present in the book of Acts as the early church is interacting with non-Jewish people, engaging with their culture, and finding those avenues of bridging gospel conversations, talking about Jesus Christ. So I appreciate both of you sharing that. I do want to lean in a little bit more on the topic of hip-hop before we move on. Ricky, you taught, can you remind us again, what was the class that you taught at Moody before transitioning into your PhD work?
So I taught a few. I was a faculty member at Moody for 4 years. So I taught mostly courses. I was a theology professor. Most of the courses I taught were about the relationship between theology and culture in the broadest sense. Sometimes that dealt with issues of ethnicity and race. Sometimes it dealt with cultural productions, right? Things like the production of hip hop and what that means. And so it was always fun to have students trying to think through, to Jeremy's point, dissecting and thinking through hip hop, but as a language, right? Trying to better understand what this means and what people are actually saying.
That segues us into Ivos, Salvadorian saying from Jeremy's other half, where they say, and you. And so this is where we, after everything that we've talked about, how do you process through some of those things? So can you share a little bit of how Vico C was influential to you? I know you touched a little bit on it at the beginning, but we'd love to unpack that a little bit more. Who is Vico C to you, Jeremy Barahona, the bishop, West Palm Beach, church planting?
I don't know about bishop, but to Ricky's point, Ricky, you just said that it might be both spectrums where hip hop not only shapes a community but also tells about the community. I think that's what Vico has done for me personally as a pastor. When I was younger in Bible college, I remember just telling myself and telling other people, like, man, I wasn't exposed to quote unquote solid theologians. Like that just wasn't me. When I was comparing the theologians I was reading in Bible college to the ones I grew up in. But then I came to a realization, I don't know when, but some few years into my academic studies, I realized that I was shaped theologically by Vico C more than anyone else. And I believe that he is a theologian. And he had a way of fusing evangelism, this bold evangelistic zeal for Jesus, social action, and testimony together in song, all rooted in the Bible. So because I listened to Vico so much, for me, that was formative, not only in the way that I did ministry, but also in the way that I thought about God, and the way I thought about society, and in the way that I want to kind of merge those things coming from a biblical worldview now in my ministry life. So that's the impact that Vico C has had on me and continues to have still to this day.
Mm-hmm. I had the privilege of seeing Vico C in concert a little later, and I mean, he was basically at the point of retirement by the time I saw him, but it was still cool to see him do all his classics. I bring that up because one of the things that Vico C and hip hop in general, I think, has yielded to the church is a kind of honesty about vice, about sin, about struggle in the broadest sense. I'll never forget that time I saw Vico C live. He talked about his addiction. He talked about the times he had relapsed, the times he had recovered. He asked the audience for prayer, for crying out loud, right? Like, he asked the audience to be with him in that. And I remember thinking, this is wild to me, right? That this dude's not up here telling a victory story. He's telling a story of God's work in his life and admitting that work still requires continued support from the community. And so I think one of the things that Vico C yields is a kind of transparency about the ways in which the gospel does save, and we continue to struggle then with the returning effects of life's vices. And so, yeah, I think there's something theologically rich there, right? That the Lord's grace is immensely visible, even in a life marked by vice. Even in a life marked by vice. And so I think that's one of the things that he yields. And then the other thing that I'll say about Vico C in particular, to Jeremy's point, he was political out of the gate. Before Residente, before some of these other guys who were super political, there was Vico C. And he would come at politicians. He would come at capitalistic, big business, right? The pharmaceutical companies. He'd come at all these folks for the ways in which... Yeah, right. In the name of Jesus, for the ways in which they were... the ways in which they were poisoning the community. And I think, again, that gives a kind of paradigm of what it means to be a storyteller, a voice, as it were, for the people in which you're representing. And those two things, to me, stand out as major lessons that we can kind of gain from hip-hop in general and from Vico C in specific.
I think that's really important to say, especially going back to that aspect of him being vulnerable and being honest about his struggles, yet us knowing he was a Christian, right? And I say that as a kid, growing up, where my mom, we would always go to the Christian bookstore, and my mom's not buying Nas and Jay for me. She was like, go to the hip hop section there, and get you one of them little Vico C tapes or whatever. But we would listen to music together. They would allow me to listen.
This man is old. He said tapes.
Tapes, bro. Tapes. I'm 33. I was on the back end of tapes. We were transitioning into CDs. But the crazy thing, this is the crazy thing about Vico, that it teaches something, is that many times he allowed us into his process. And most times, especially when we think about like church planting and pastors, we just look for end product in people. Like, that's what I want. I want to be like that end product. And then we realize, like, some of our heroes, they've been dealing with some crazy stuff. Well, I think Vico, as a leader, I would say, as a theologian in my eyes, he didn't just show us the end product of God's work, but God's actual process as he was going through it. And that taught me a lot about being honest about my own struggles and also being accountable, right? So and I think that's something that, in terms of my worldview, like, it's even to this day shocking to me when leaders aren't vulnerable with at least their clique about the things that they're dealing with as pastors, as leaders. So I think that was something that Vico taught me and shaped in my mind.
No, that's good. I want to mention two things that you guys both shared as you talk about the life of Vico C. Ricky, you said it in these words that he did have a life marked by vice, but he was also recognized as a political symbol. Jeremy, you phrased it this way, that he was a prophet from the barrio. So I'm curious to know, man, like what is it, like what keeps the church from recognizing guys like Vico C and like hip hop artists as these influential figures and learning from them?
Yeah, I think the difference between Jeremy and I earlier, I think, demonstrates the point there, right? Well, I came from a church background in Pentecostalism that was rooted in respectability, right? We got to look good in front of the white folk. So hip hop was not a good thing. But Jeremy's church was right away using it as an outreach. And for the record, so was my church background, right? They would talk all this talk about like, yo, this is not good, this is not godly, and then I and others were doing hip hop concerts everywhere, but somehow that was exceptional, right? So it was a strange dissonance that I think has been resolved over the years. I think the church is at a different place today than it is otherwise. And to be honest, I'm not sure it matters as we think about the different church plants that are going out in the future, right? Jeremy is going to be doing church in a very different way than some of the church patterns that we inherit. The fact that the Light is an attempt to plant a church for bicultural Latinos, that alone is different, right? And that opens to different influences, including the influence of hip hop, right? And so I don't think we have to sweat or fear some of those old habits. We have to be honest about them to go back to Vico C, right? We got to be transparent about the ways that the church had its own vices, right? Its own obsession with respectability and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think church planters like Jeremy and what's going on in the Light are going to open up a new way of doing things that I think is going to be important.
Man. So let me just close out with this final question. What are some lessons that we can learn from hip hop culture, hip hop hustle, and how can we continue to use hip hop to create those inroads into our communities as church leaders?
Pastor, that's on you.
Yeah, I think just drawn from my own experience growing up, and again, my experience was not everybody's experience, but hip hop, especially as a youth in Palm Beach County, and my church was used as a platform to use our gifts. Right, like I remember, man, when I was in seminary, asking this dude, I was like, "Yo, how many times have you preached or spoken in front of people?" And it was like a genuine question. He was like, "Man, once in his whole life." And I was like, man, that's so different from my experience. My experience was, I was constantly, for better or for worse, sometimes with great character, sometimes with horrible character, thrusted into the forefront doing outreach speaking, preaching before crowds.
That's facts.
But my church really leveraged that as a platform, leveraged hip hop as a platform to not only use my gifts but also shape the culture around us. So that's one way. I think, man, one thing that I love about hip hop in general is just this entrepreneurial spirit, right? Like if you watch the Vico C biopic, you just see, man, how like he was just working with what he had, and not only that, but I think like the fact that he wanted to rap in Spanish and be really, really dope, that was like innovative back then. And Vico was doing everything from reggaeton to, boom bap type stuff. So I think
merengue, he got involved in all sorts of things.
All sorts of things. And I think what his example, and I think this goes for hip hop in general, is that we don't need to do things in the same way. Of course, we want to keep the integrity of the message, but our methodology needs to switch up. And I would say this, in a community like mine, sometimes to people it's dope when you're actually doing something that's fresh and new, or you're doing an old thing in a new way. I think we can really learn that from hip hop.
Man, this one last question came to mind, and then we'll wrap up. and I'll open this to both of you too. How do we identify and raise up the next Vico C, whether it's in our church or in our community?
Yo, this is a huge topic that I've been thinking a lot about. I think we need to be discipling our youth as we empower them. Right? And not just our youth, anybody really using that gift, because it's older dudes out there and ladies getting it. I think we really need to be discipling them as we're platforming them. Yeah, and by discipling, I think we really need to teach people how to walk with Jesus when nobody's watching. Right? And then I think we need to continue to call talent out of people and pushing them to the forefront. Because I don't know. This is just my opinion.
These are the parts of Jeremy that I think are super Latino. I'll just say this before you finish your thought, Jeremy. Go ahead. I'll say this. I bring that up because I did say earlier that as a church planter, he's gonna make some changes, but some things should stay the same.
Right.
And he talked about how his church was using young folk to go out there and do music, good character or bad character, for better or worse. He was up there preaching gospel. I think that's one thing that's unique to the diaspora of churches, right? Those migrant churches that are here in the U.S. They are super committed to intergenerational models of ministry. The young people will be up on stage. I mean, we're recording this on Good Friday, right? I don't know, Jeremy, if your church did las siete palabras on Good Friday, right? The seven final words of Jesus. Do you know how many times I sat through terrible sermons on Good Friday of las siete palabras, all done by youth group kids? No adults, all youth group kids doing the siete palabras. It happened all the time. All the time. But there was a commitment, right, to involve the young people in the Easter weekend services, and that to me is super powerful as a example of ministry. So as Jeremy talks about how we need to disciple while empowering, right? What does that sound like? That sounds like the habit of the Latino church already, right? This is a good, healthy aspect of this expression of church. So just my thoughts.
No, that's good. That's good. And I think if we don't do that, I think we're missing out. And what I was gonna say, just to add, was it seems to me, at least in my neighborhood and when I lived in Chicago, that even Christian hip hop is so far removed from what's actually going on in the streets. Like, very far removed. And by far removed, I mean maybe the rappers, like, and gatekeepers, I'm just going to assume they're involved in their local communities and that kind of thing. But I'm like, who's actually touching the streets? Yeah. So I think, man, this is just my opinion. My opinion is this. I think that Christian hip-hop, in some sense, needs to get back to its roots also of engaging the streets right where they're at. And I think the church, especially the urban church, needs to continue or to pick up again using Christian hip hop in their outreaches, in their evangelistic outreaches. Because, man, there really is an opportunity out here to do that. And, one of my biggest fears is that Christian hip hop is just being used for kids who don't even, I'm gonna just put it like this, kids that don't even identify with hip hop. They're just kind of like used for youth groups.
Wow.
During the game time, and then
you can say it's suburb kids. You can say it.
I'll just leave it there. But what I'm saying is there's opportunity. And can I just add one more thing, man? I'm kind of passionate about this topic. I think many of us, when we were coming up, one of the reasons why at certain points we learn even our craft well is because sometimes we would show up on the block and it's like, just rap. Ain't nobody know you, you got to learn how to work a crowd. You got to learn how to win people to you. Like, even from a craft standpoint, I think if we get back to that, it'll make people better as artists, as performers. That's just my opinion. But anyways,
with the mic drop at the end, man, thank you guys for the conversation. As we wrap up, Ricky, can you tell us what we can expect coming up from World Outspoken? This is your time to plug whatever you want, man.
Yeah, so I'll just say more about the Learning Center. We're really growing the course catalog that we have there. We're, as I mentioned before, we're super committed to helping churches address the cultural changes they're experiencing. And we're committed to preparing leaders like Jeremy, who are standing in between the Spanish language and English language, the generation of old and the generation now, right? The different dynamics racially, ethnically, all those things, right? And so go to learn.worldoutspoken.com, get your ministry leveled up, take a class, learn. These are not, I'll say this, we are not trying to get you to do some college intensive, right? The benefit of doing classes like these is that, number one, speaking of context, these classes are really specific to the kinds of things that we face. These are not classes that are going to make sense everywhere. They make sense for us. Does that make sense? For our kind of peoples. And I don't mean that Latinos only. I just mean people who have gone through that migrant church experience, right? So learn.worldoutspoken.com, take a class. 1, because they're super specific in that way. 2, because they're affordable. And 3, this is my favorite part about it. You take the class as a kind of self-paced. It's all you don't have like a deadline. There's no timetable when you take it. But while you're in the class, you're in there with other leaders. There's opportunities to talk in forums with other pastors and leaders who are dealing with the same kinds of issues, whether they be Filipino, Puerto Rican, Salvadorian, or Korean, right? These are pastors, leaders, nonprofit leaders, ministry leaders who are facing the kinds of questions you're facing in your hood, and there's an opportunity to have conversations as part of the class with them as well. So check out learn.worldoutspoken.com. There are 3 classes up now. There are 2 more going up in the fall, sometime in August or September. One on preaching, one that's going to be, Lord willing, on immigration policies and how the church can be involved. So so stay tuned. There's a lot that's going to be going up and onto the platform there. But there are opportunities to do stuff where you don't gotta pay a big tuition bill to get some kind of degree. This is just a way of training you to deal with your stuff.
Man,
fresh off the press.
Yes, sir. Super exciting, man. Thank you for sharing that with us, Jeremy. When can we expect that EP to drop, bro?
When World Outspoken funds it, yeah.
Hip Hop Hustle on full display.
World Outspoken Hip Hop Ministries Inc.
Hey,
that's
man,
a long
there's our
name
label.
For a label. That's a long name for a label.
That's Latino. That's Latino church name. Church name.
Yo, that's
it's
real.
Like Iglesia Juan 3. Yeah. Iglesia Juan 3:16. Cristo.
That names be mad long. Iglesia el manantial del Espíritu Santo y fuego y unción.
And ink in Florida. Ink.
It's not legit without ink. You got to become the Light West Palm Beach ink. That's people are gonna take you seriously.
Technically, on paper we do have the ink.
Hey, there you go.
We do business as without it. But anyway,
man, that's all the time for our episode. Thank you, Ricky, for joining us on another one.
It's a joy.
Really appreciate you, man. Jeremy, appreciate the conversation as always. Man, take care, guys.
Take care, man.
Peace, familia.